What's up, guys? This is Jan for Chess24. The Moscow Candidates Tournament is heating up, and as game of the day, I've chosen the encounter between two of the frontrunners, Vishy Anand with the white pieces against Sergei Karjakin. This game is from round number 11 of 14 rounds total. So let's have a look at the standings before this encounter. We see Fabiano Caruana is in front, equal points with Sergei Karjakin, who has not lost a game yet in this tournament. Vishy Anand only half a point behind. He would love to overtake Karjakin's position, and in order to do that, he would have to defeat him with the white pieces. Anand has been doing very well with white in this tournament, scored 3 victories, no defeats. Things haven't been going so well with black, where he has 2 losses and no victories. This time he's white, and he sticks to the move he's played all tournament, the move 1e4. And like everybody else in this tournament so far who's faced 1e4, Karjakin goes for the symmetrical 1e5. Knight f3, knight c6. Anand returns after a brief flirt with the Italian bishop c4, which brought him a full point against Levan Aronian 2 rounds earlier. Returns to the move bishop b5, his main weapon, the Ruy Lopez. Knight f6, also pretty much the only move played in this tournament if your name is not Peter Svidler, who has twice played a6, not successfully. Knight f6 to Berlin. Here, once again, everybody but Svidler plays the move d3. Svidler once tried short castles, the former mainline. d3 is a move Anna has already played in this tournament, and they followed that game, his first round game against Veselin Topalov, for a couple moves. Bishop c5, c3, castles, short castles, and d6. Big tabia at the highest level at this moment in the game against Topalov. Anand played the main move here, knight bd2, developing the knight, supporting the e4 pawn, and Topalov played the fashionable maneuver, the move knight to e7, trying to regroup this knight, which is misplaced on c6, to the better square g6. After d4, this is what they do to use the absence of this knight from the center. E takes d4, c takes d4, bishop b6. Anand did win the game, but not because of the opening, and maybe therefore, this time around, he decides to deviate, plays a different move, h3. Also a useful move, but there are some differences to knight bd2, and we're gonna see them in the game because Karjakin chooses the same maneuver, the move knight to e7, and white once again decides this is the moment to push in the center by going d3, d4. Here, difference number 1 is that if black were to take on d4 and play bishop b6, then this knight could go to the much more active c3 square, wouldn't have to go to d2. This is a very nice position for white. So, not surprisingly, black doesn't go for this because he can't use difference number 2, which is that after bishop b6, the pawn on e4 is en prise. It's not protected by the knight just yet. So if white were to take on e5, black would just go knight takes e4, and this would just lead to the disappearance of all pawns from the center with an equal position. Therefore, Anand plays differently. Nothing new here yet. He goes for the move bishop to d3, reinforcing his center, and still not committing this knight to the d2 square. Black has a choice here. The most natural move is knight to g6, just keeping e5 protected when a slow maneuvering game would follow. White could play something like bishop e3, then follow with knight bd2. Not claiming an advantage, but a playable position. Instead, Karjakin decides to seize the moment to immediately liquidate in the center, playing d5, still following big names, including himself. He's played this earlier, but also we are following a game between Magnus Carlsen, the world champion, against Vladimir Kramnik, the former world champion. Where this position occurred, Magnus Carlsen played knight bd2 here. Didn't achieve very much, but later went on to win the game. Vishy decides to go his own way by taking the pawn on e5 with the knight. Knight takes e5, and Karjakin follows suit, goes knight takes e4. Now we have a more or less symmetrical pawn structure that more often arises from openings like the Petrov defense or the Berlin with rook e1, where it's quite typical that these pawns are exchanged for each other. White's hopes for an advantage are based on the fact that the bishop on b6 is a little misplaced. Would much rather be on d6 like its white counterpart. Anand starts with knight d2, doesn't mind exchanging this knight, and Karjakin decides not to do it, but to keep it on the board, put it on the nice d6 square. Nothing particularly wrong with knight takes d2 either, but white maintains a small initiative in lines like this one, queen f3 or queen g4, and black is still under a bit of pressure because his bishop is temporarily out of play. So Karjakin decides to go knight d6, keeping an eye on the f5 square, preparing the move bishop to f5. The drawback is that this knight is sort of blocking this diagonal from his own bishop. Should this bishop ever make it to c7, the knight would be in the way. Anand plays a move that is not that obvious, at least to me, but quite good. Knight to b3, not only stopping black from going c5, but also clearing the way for his own bishop to develop to f4, and leaving the f3 square open for the knight on e5. If white played the more natural knight f3, then black would go f6, and after knight g4, this knight wouldn't be too happy. Bishop f5 with an equal position. So knight b3, interesting move, also intending to jump onto c5 should the opportunity arise. And it does arise instantly because Karjakin goes c6, doesn't want to weaken himself by playing f6, which came into consideration as well. Knight f3, bishop f5. When, yeah, it doesn't look like much, but white can hope for a tiny initiative after a move like bishop f4. Some lines intending knight c5. Not much to achieve, but that's normal in the opening for everybody playing white in the candidates. Players are very well prepared with black. They're playing solidly, so you can't hope to crush people out of the opening. Karjakin goes c6, and Anand immediately jumps into c5, putting his knight on an active square, trying to maybe discourage black from going bishop f5, developing his bishop, because his pawn could become a little weak. Still possible, but white would try for a little initiative. I'm overusing the word little, a little. After, for example, bishop takes d3, knight e takes d3, there's a threat of bishop d6 followed by knight b7, and keeping this pawn alive is a little awkward for black. So, some slight pressure on the black position. Karjakin decides to solve his problems a different way. He goes knight to g6, intends to exchange this knight for the knight on e5, and also posing the direct threat of taking here and then taking on c5. Anand parries that with a nice active move, the move queen to h5, obviously stopping any knight e5 action because of queen h7 checkmate, and also keeping control over the f5 square, therefore discouraging black from even thinking about exchanging these bishops. First sight, I thought that white had some serious pressure here, but then I saw what Karjakin did about it, and I changed my mind. Karjakin decided to simplify here by going bishop takes c5, d takes c5, and knight to e4, blocking this diagonal, attacking the c5 pawn, and showing his intentions to exchange his knight now that he can, followed by rook e8, for example. White doesn't really have a big choice here. He could play a move like bishop e3, just defending c5, but after, let's say, rook e8, knight takes g6, h takes g, queen somewhere, bishop to f5, I find it very hard to believe that white has any advantage here. The black pieces are quite well developed. Black is very solid. Therefore, Anand decides to do something else, which is to take on e4, give up his bishop for the knight, d takes e4, when we have a position with opposite color bishops that looks fairly equal, but Anand manages to find a way to keep some life in the position. He goes rook d1 with tempo, fighting for the d file. The black queen has to move, queen e7, targeting those two guys, so white once again has no choice but to play knight takes g6, h takes g, and now queen to g5. This sequence is more or less forced, and after queen takes g5, bishop takes g5, at first sight I thought this game was over and would end in a draw in a couple more moves, which is not what is going to happen, as you can imagine, since this is our game of the day. White is trying to build up a bit of initiative on the d-file, which he can seize control of. Black won't be in time to challenge it, and then he does have the plan of pushing his queenside pawns to try to build a passed pawn on the queen side. Well, for black it's a little harder to create this passed pawn on the king side because white has his bishop in the way, which covers the sensitive f4 square, for example. Karjakin plays f6, very natural, chasing this bishop away, stopping its control over the d8 square, and Anand instructively puts it on e3, which might look passive, but if this bishop were to go to the nicer looking square on d6, all it would do is block the d-file for his own rooks, and black would face no particular problems. He would even have counterplay based on e4, e3. Therefore, bishop to e3 is a better move. Karjakin keeps playing natural moves, the move g6, g5, controlling the f4 square, and also opening up this diagonal for his bishop should he need it in order to defend the e4 pawn. Anand doubles his rooks on the d file, rook d6, rook to e8, rook a d1. And Karjakin develops his bishop to e6. You could argue if he should have gone to f5 immediately, but I don't think would have made a massive difference. On f5, this bishop is always going to be questioned with the move g2 to g4 at some point. Another alternative that was here and in a couple other situations is to play the move g5 to g4. If white were to take this, then black would be absolutely fine, developing with tempo. So g4 more or less forces white to play h4, and changing the structure like that has pros and cons. The bishop on f5 can no longer be challenged, but the white bishop gains access to the f4 square. White could maybe still count on a teeny tiny advantage here. Bishop e6 played in the game, targeting a2, so Anand goes b3, instructively putting his pawns on light squares, not on dark squares here, to restrict the enemy bishop. King f7, rook 1 d4, starting to ask some questions like how do you plan to defend this e4 pawn? The only answer to this is the move bishop to f5. But now this bishop faces the dilemma I mentioned earlier, that after g4 it's going to have to decide on his diagonal. If it stays on this diagonal, it gives up the d7 square. If it stays on this one, it's probably going to give up the e4 pawn. Anand's not in a hurry, however. He first goes a4, indicating that his plan is to play b4, b5, also using the absence of this bishop from this diagonal to get this in. Karjakin decides to wait by playing rook to e7. You could make a case for the move a5 here. It looks strange to move pawns on the side where you're weaker, but at least this makes it much harder for white to get in b4, because in such a line the a4 pawn would drop. So a5 was an interesting option, but Karjakin decides to just wait, go rook e7, now Anand goes g4, and the bishop goes to h7. Note that it goes to h7 and not to g6, because it's intending to rejoin the battle on this diagonal should an opportunity arise. Anand continues with his plan. He plays the move b4, intending to push b5, and this is where Karjakin, I believe, should have done something different. He has to figure out how to deal with the threat of b5. If he goes a6, which might look natural, that doesn't really stop b5. White just plays c4, and it's back on the agenda. But there was a surprising move here, which was very interesting, which is to play the move a5. Now, it doesn't look very natural. It's encouraging white to go for his breakthrough b5. But the point is, after takes, now this pawn being on a5 has become a passed pawn itself, and it's quite a distraction for white. After a4, you gotta do something about it. If you try to stop it by going rook d2, intending rook a2, black has a sneaky little move in form of king to e8. Clearing this diagonal for his bishop, defending against rook a2. Let's say rook a2 now runs into bishop g8. And it seems like his a-pawn would offer black enough counterplay here. Therefore, I believe this was a good chance for Karjakin to alter the structure, play a5, and solve most of his problems. Instead he played bishop g8, trying to occupy this diagonal if it's needed, and Anand wastes no time, plays b5. Attacking the c6 pawn, which has to be defended, rook to c8. Black clearly doesn't want to take here, because this would ease white's task to create one passed pawn. So rook c8, Anand goes rook d7, hinting at his ideas to exchange rooks, but mainly putting black under some pressure. Black clearly can't take, because this rook would occupy the 7th rank. So Karjakin instead decides to stay passive, go rook e8, maybe intending to recapture here with the rook if it's needed. Now Anand plays an instructive move. You don't want to go bc6 after bc6. It's very hard to create a passed pawn or even targets on the queen side. But instead he plays the move b5 to b6, which looks like it's going nowhere. But it is a far advanced pawn, and that's always a factor in endgames. If black were to take this, then white would have the very simple plan of a5 and a6 at the right moment, creating a passed b-pawn. You can't and don't want to allow this with black. So Karjakin rightly keeps the position close, goes a6. But now you have to live with this thorn on the flesh on b6. And it's already starting to show its benefits after white's next move, the move rook c7. White gained this square as an operating base after b6. Black can't really take, or has to be very careful about taking, because it would always create a dangerously advanced c-pawn. Even though white has triple c-pawns, they're all doing good work. This one is threatening to become a queen, and the one on c5 is restricting the black pawns from advancing, so this would be extremely dangerous for black. Instead, Karjakin decides to wait, go king f8, opening this diagonal for his bishop, but Anand doesn't waste any time and closing it again, goes c4, occupying the d5 square. Here Karjakin takes an interesting, but I think not a bad decision. To move bishop e6, he deliberately gives up his e4 pawn, and his idea is that he thinks eventually he's going to have to take on c7, then he wants his bishop to occupy this queening square and also assist in picking up this pawn, should it be possible. There were some alternatives, but if black just waits passively, let's say bishop f7, white has plenty ways to improve his position, bring the king to g3, then maybe go h4. After this pawn gets exchanged, his bishop could re-enter the game via f4. So it was not an easy position to just sit and wait. Karjakin decides on this plan with bishop e6, rook takes e4, and king f7, trying to harmonize his remaining forces. Now, there is a threat of rook takes c7, followed by rook c8, picking up the pawn. Therefore, white has to do something. If white were to take on e7, the position would be pretty much drawn. Rook takes e7, and since all bishop endgames are drawn, black can just move his bishop and then chase the white rook along the open files. This does not offer a great deal of hope. But Anand finds a nice resource here. He goes for the move f4, trying to include his bishop into the game, which makes it a lot harder for black to just take on c7 and then take the pawn without being bothered. Karjakin still decides to do so. He takes on c7 and goes rook c8. His reasoning, which is probably correct, is that if white takes the pawn on g5 after rook c7, even though he's a pawn down, this position should be defendable. You just sit and wait, and it's very hard to believe that this 2 against 1 will get the job done for white. But Anand plays a stronger move. Very resourceful game by Anand. I'm not going to claim I understand everything he's doing, but he certainly managed to keep the pressure up for a long, long time. He goes f5, obviously forcing black to go bishop d7, and now we see the point. He follows up with h4. If black were to take this pawn, material would be equal, but he can use his bishop on the f4 square to support this far advanced pawn on c7, which you can no longer get rid of here with excellent winning chances. Maybe it's even smarter to start with rook d4, but you get the idea. While if black does not take this pawn, but takes on c7 after hg, fg, once again, bishop g5, this is a much better version for white. He still has 2 against 1, but his pawn on f5 severely restricts the black bishop. He has an entry square on e7, and here black certainly has to suffer. He could have chosen this, here a move like bishop c8, and I'm not sure if this is winning. Once again, you could make a case for the computer move rook d4 before taking on g5. Always with pressure, but with decent drawing chances for black. But Karjakin takes a very responsible decision here. On move 38, close to the time control, he plays g6, trying to get rid of more pawns, which in general is good defensive technique. If you're the weaker side, you want to exchange as many pawns as possible. Turns out though that this is not so easy to do, and Anand is up to the task. He finds a very strong, quiet, well not that quiet, but not obvious move here. The move rook d4, forcing black to take on c7. And now he goes h takes g5. And his first point is, if black takes on f5, there is bishop f4, picking up material. Can't do it. Therefore, Karjakin takes on g5 first, after bishop takes g5. There is still the same idea, gf no good because of bishop f4, winning material. Therefore, black has to move this bishop out of the way. And now Anand manages to keep this pawn alive and transform it into a passed pawn on f6 supported by the bishop, which does keep his winning chances alive. I'm not enough of an expert to claim if this position is actually winning for white or not. It feels like black still has pretty good chances to create a fortress. If the rooks were exchanged, it would be a simple draw. But with rooks on the board, white certainly has chances. And for the moment, both sides maneuver a little back and forth, trying to find squares for their pieces. King f8, bishop f4, rook h7, occupying the h-file, king g2, improving the king, bishop d7, bishop g5. Wise decision not to go g5 here, which might look natural, but it gives black this operating base for his bishop, and it also blocks the g5 square, which in the distant future could very well be destination for the white king. So I believe g5 would have been a mistake, and bishop g5 by Anand is an excellent choice, keeping this pawn on g4 to restrict the bishop. Bishop e6, rook d8 check. Now Anand goes for a concrete operation. He does want to go after the b7 pawn. It's not clear black could have stopped this in the long run, because you can't just wait around for white to improve his position. So I believe bishop e6 was fine. Rook d8, king f7, rook to b8. Now the b7 pawn can't be saved, but in return black can take one of white's pawns. To my small surprise, Karjakin decides on bishop c4. I thought at first sight you want to get rid of this pawn, because this pawn looks less dangerous. But after rook b7, king g8, rook b6, this has its problems as well, because now this bishop doesn't have the square d5, and it's going to be very hard, not to say impossible, to defend both pawns on the queen side. So this would also be troubles for black. I'm not sure if it's losing. Rook h5, bishop e3, and there is still some counterplay, rook f5, but it certainly feels very, very dangerous. Instead, Karjakin, who is one of the, if not the best defender in the business, does take the pawn on c4, rook b7, and king g8 only move. The bishop endgame is still a draw, so you cannot do that. Black would just go bishop b3, force a5, then stop the f-pawn with his king and use his bishop from b5 to defend his queenside. It is pretty much a dead draw. Of course, Anand understands that, keeps the rooks on the board, and we enter the next round of maneuvering with a new structure. Rook b8, king f7, king g3, king e6, rook e8 check. Nasty little move, because the king can't go to d5 due to rook e7, and all of a sudden this pawn would queen. Not going to be able to stop it. Therefore the king has to decide which way he wants to go, d7 or f7. Karjakin decides on f7. Had it gone to d7, there's a nice little trick here, rook d8 check, forcing it to once again commit, because you can't take this rook since this pawn becomes a queen. And you can't go back to e6 either, since then this is being picked up. Therefore, I believe king f7 was a correct decision. Anand tries rook c8, targeting this pawn, but of course it's defended with bishop d5, king f4. Once again, this is good technique, little probing, little back and forth, looking for an entry into the black position while improving his own. King e6, natural enough move, covering the e5 square. Rook a8 check once again, asking the king to commit. This time it goes to d7, and one reason that this time around it goes here is that now rook d8 is not such a great idea anymore, because even though white gets a new queen, with his king being on f4, his queen will not have a lot of longevity, and the ensuing endgame is just a draw. So king d7, rook to a8. Now Anand changes plans, goes after the a6 pawn, asks black what he plans to do about that. Karjakin is once again up to the task, goes king to e6. When rook takes a6, it's not a great idea, because black gets counterplay with rook h3, threatening rook f3 checkmate. And in order to stop that, you would have to move the bishop, but it can't go anywhere where it's not captured. So rook a6 was wrong, and therefore Anand repeats the position with rook a8 check, king d7, and starts a new round of maneuvering. Rook e3, just covering the h3 square and seeing what happens next. a5 played by Karjakin, and this is a very committal decision, which I believe is wrong, because you put this pawn on a dark square where it can fall victim to the white bishop later in the game, and if this a-pawn falls, it would probably lead to many situations where white can even win a pure bishop endgame, can agree to the exchange of rooks, so it is a highly committal decision. I'm not sure if waiting would have saved the game. This would need more detailed analysis, but I do believe it was more resilient to play something like bishop e6, when probably Karjakin disliked that he can get fixed by a5, and then white would maneuver, trying to put his pawn on the b file. But still, this gave much better chances. Let's say you start with rook e1, bishop d5, a5, bishop e6, rook b1, king to c7, and there is still no clear breakthrough. Rook b6, bishop c4. You still gotta win this position. Might be winning, but it would not have been easy. Instead, a5 was played, and Anand goes king g3, maybe clearing the way for his bishop, maybe just maneuvering, repeating the position once. Now he tries rook e1, intending to go to b1. Black anticipates that arrival by going king c8, but king c8 in return vacates the e8 square. Very hard for black to cover everything here. King g3 once again, covering h3, planning bishop d2 if needed. Rook f7 stops bishop d2, but now the rook penetrates. Rook e8, king d7, rook a8, going after the a5 pawn. But Karjakin's resources aren't exhausted yet. He finds a nice little trap. He goes king to c7. His point is, if this rook were to take the pawn, then he would go king b7, and this rook will never make it out of his jail. In fact, the position is a dead draw, believe it or not. You can't win this rook, but you also can't free it, and black can just sit and wait. There's absolutely nothing white can do. Of course, Anand sees that, and he once again goes king f4, planning to improve his king first before committing to anything. Rook to d7, waiting, bishop h4, nice move. Playing bishop e1, targeting this pawn, and king g5, targeting this pawn. Little but very, very powerful move, sign of very good technique. Karjakin once again invites the white rook to move into the lovely a5 mansion, but you can never leave that one. Therefore, Anand declines, goes rook e8, and we see the black defenses are starting to crumble. King g5 is there, bishop e1 is there. In many lines, rook e7 is there now, especially if the king decides to go too far away to the queen side, and this position, I believe, can no longer be saved. Karjakin tries bishop f7, Anand goes rook e4, keeping his options open, bishop d5, rook e3, bishop back to f7, and king to g5. The king is showing it means business either this way or this way, after which it can enter via f6. There's still this idea. Karjakin here decides to at least try to defend his a-pawn with king a6, but the price for that is that his king leaves the battlefield in the center, and after rook e7 it turns out that the bishop endgame can no longer be saved. The point is rook takes e7, f takes e7, the king can run back to support the bishop, but it doesn't help. The prettiest line is something like this: king to c8, king f8, king d7. Here white doesn't even need to go after the a5 pawn, even though he certainly could. He can just play the cruel move bishop g5, and it's Zugzwang. Try any move for black, any move loses this bishop and leads to instant resignation. Therefore, Karjakin, of course, understood all that. He also understood that rook d5, king h6 check does not help his cause because his bishop is dropping. And he did resign. It's a confusing game. Smooth victory for Vishy Anand, very technical. One of these games where it's very hard to say where black went wrong. You could certainly question some decisions in the opening. This knight g6 move I'm not sure about. But to win this endgame against a technician of Sergei Karjakin's caliber is an impressive achievement. Karjakin might have relaxed too early, thinking the game was going to be a draw. But Vishy Anand keeps grinding out technical wins with the white pieces. And with this win, he now has 4 white wins. He puts himself into a very interesting position in the tournament. We're going to study the table in a second. If you don't want to see the other results, switch off the video now. This was the standings before round 11, but hopefully I will be able to bring up the rankings after round 11 in 1 second. Here we go. And we see that Vishy Anand is on the joint lead with Fabiano Caruana, who drew his game against Veselin Topalov out of a very good position. Caruana does hold a tiebreaker, which means if these guys should finish first share on points, Caruana would qualify for a match against Carlsen, not Anand. Anand needs half a point more than Caruana in order to finish ahead of him. But still, of course, he put himself into a great position, overtaking Sergei Karjakin, who suffers his first loss of the tournament. Our friend Peter Svidler with his first win, comeback win against Levon Aronian, who falls back to 50%, where he's joined by Svidler and Anish Giri, who did not manage to win a very nice position against Hikaru Nakamura, while Nakamura and Topalov remain at the bottom of the table. That's it for today. Thank you guys for watching. Still 3 rounds to go. The action is only gonna heat up. See you soon.